Thank you, Sabina. Thank you, Sister Helen. And thank you, everyone, for joining me in this moment of reflection, philosophical reflection after lunch. And this is quite difficult, we know, but we are going to try to do our best. The contemporary literature on the nature of the dignity of the person is very extensive. Likewise, studies addressing the relationship between dignity and people with disabilities have begun to appear in recent times. As in many other issues in which the recognition of the human person as a person is at stake, the controversy over dignity and disability explicitly, or at least implicitly, involves topics as varied as the notion of health, the role of context, capabilities, functional diversity, common human nature, the idea of justice, the scope of practical reason, and the problem of the very notion of personhood. This is not surprising. The United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, in its preamble, has risked a sort of definition of disability that immediately appeals to a set of issues that are not easy to clarify. Quote, disability is an evolving concept resulting from the interaction between people with impairments and attitudinal and environmental barriers that prevent their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others, end of quote. And further on, in its first article, it states, quote, persons with disabilities include those who have long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairments, which in interaction with various barriers may hinder their full and effective participation in society on an equal basis with others. End of the quote. In a recent document of the Pontifical Academy for Life, this general approach is also assumed, and the elements offered in the World Health Organization's International Classification of Funding Disability and Health, ICF, are cited as inspiration. The Pontifical Academy for Life says, in the very, very recent document published about discapacity and COVID, quote, disability refers to any physical and mental health impairment or condition that, when interacting with environmental and social factors, limits a person's functioning and participation in society. Examples of disability include limited mobility, impaired vision or hearing, genetic and neurodevelopmental conditions such as Down syndrome or autism spectrum disorder, acquired brain injuries, dementia, and certain mental health conditions, end of the quote. The ICF provides a conceptual basis for defining and measuring health and disability. Thus, it is possible for the Pontifical Academy for Life document to state that, quote, 1 in 6 people in the world, or more than 1 billion, live with some level of disability, end of the quote. In the following, we will limit ourselves to point out some of the main elements that allow us to overcome the easy invisibilization of the dignity of persons with disabilities. We will insist mainly on the value of the personalized norm of action, persona est affirmanda propter se ipsam, on the roots of dignity, and on the need to distinguish between the ultimate metaphysical foundation of the person as subject with dignity and the ultimate normative foundation in order to actively recognize the person as a non-instrumentalizable subject. First point, the obscuring of dignity, the problem of the throwaway culture. Contemporary society is complex. Social phenomena are often multi-causal and cannot be defined by a single aspect. However, one of the axes around which an important part of culture seems to revolve is precisely the identification of the rational as a primarily instrumental phenomenon. Indeed, not only Max Horkheimer identified that purely pragmatic reason becomes a maddening machine that ends up sacrificing its own creators, but Joseph Ratzinger himself, in Introduction to Christianity, emphasizes that something proper to our time is that truth ceased to be seen as a property of being, to be affirmed first as a property of human facts realized in the past, verum quia factum, And finally, as a property of human action projected into the future, verum quia facendum. This means that reason has undergone a profound mutation. It's no longer the capacity to understand reality in its ultimate and definitive meaning, but has become the capacity to exercise dominion and utilitarian transformation of the world, and in particular of people, especially the most vulnerable. Pope Francis synthetically calls this phenomenon the throwaway culture. The pragmatic and utilitarian drift of reason is no accident. When the truth is not dense, but by various means affirms that its consistency is weak, reason is subjected to the pure will to power, which no longer finds reasons to define limits. The important thing is to interpret life as a pure game of power and seek to affirm oneself through the submission and sacrifice of the other. This mentality is painfully visible not only in the games of the self-referential market, but also in the uncomfortable coexistence with the functionally diverse, fragile, and vulnerable human being. In other words, the throwaway culture shows its absurdity when it despotically sacrifices disabled people through oblivion, isolation, lack of inclusion, and lack of due care, which sometimes reaches subtle or not so subtle forms of humiliating mistreatment. Dietrich von Hildebrand offers us a hypothesis that can illuminate this question. This important philosopher, a disciple of Edmund Husserl, devoted much of his life to exploring the structure of moral life. In his analysis, he recovers many ideas from classical thought. However, he also explores new territories such as the so-called value blindness. What does this expression mean? It means that there are people, and eventually peoples, who in certain periods, sometimes very long periods, suffer from a lack of awareness of the existence and obligatory nature of some value. Value blindness is not an error in moral judgment or a certain ignorance due to lack of study. It is rather a real eclipse in the capacity to appreciate some valuable realities. Nor is value blindness a compulsive unwillingness to look or a state of distraction. There are people with great intelligence and great capacity to maintain attention, and yet they do not appreciate, do not esteem, fail to receive the provocation of a certain type of values. For example, of the dignity of the functionally diverse other. Some people, when thinking about this phenomenon, consider that a value blindness, such as the one we are describing, exempts the subject who suffers from it from responsibility. This may be true with respect to a certain specific act, but it's not true with respect to the general moral state of the subject suffering from blindness. Blindness usually arises from a culpable lack of education in the gaze and in the affective life. There are various types of value blindness. The one that interests us with respect to the subject that concerns us is the so-called subsumption moral blindness. This is a type of blindness that occurs in the person when individual interest or a passion habitually settles in the conscience and obscures the values that demand attention. It's not that the person doesn't understand theoretically the nature of his neighbor. It's not that the person doesn't perceive a certain conduct as wrong. In subsumption blindness, the issue is that in one's own life, the value in question is not perceived, and more or less immediately the reason invents subterfuges to justify the immoral conduct carried out in the name that, in this precise case, the situation is different. The lack of real and concrete appreciation for the dignity of the disabled person in many of us is due to the fact that rationality, driven by the will to power, clouds the conscience and orients the heart towards a utilitarian goal that sacrifices dignity or identifies it with a standard of functional efficiency. To sum up, when we spoke of pragmatic or instrumental rationality, we didn't mean to point to an abstract question, but rather to a concrete phenomenon of subsentient blindness that significantly determines individual and sometimes collective consciousness. Point number 2, the human person is a unique, unrepeatable, irreplaceable subject. If we look closely at the most elementary human experience, we can discover that this experience is not solitary, individual, or isolated. On the contrary, the experience of the self, with all its richness and inner tensions, has always been accompanied by the experience of a you. In fact, in the very first awakening of consciousness, when the central nervous system acquires a certain constitutional sufficiency, the I perceives the self as a place that welcomes it, as an embrace that shelters it, as a love that sustains it. To put it briefly, each of us discovers the meaning of being by discovering ourselves in original relationship with the others, who have engendered me, and eventually with the other with capital O, who has created me. At the beginning of consciousness, although the I doesn't yet perceive analytically the being of each of my parents, much less the divine being. They are already there as a presence, as a good mystery that insinuates that one's being is not rooted in oneself, but in a complex of interpersonal relationships. In this way, the other doesn't only indicate a certain distant similarity with respect to oneself, but the other participates with me in the fundamental human experience, enriching and illuminating it continuously. The other is not a more or less arbitrary projection of my own I, of my own self, but the other contributes data that only a subjectivity full of value can offer. The I is not a subjectivity that, after existing, then alters and becomes a being along with others. The I lives its own experience of being, not only being along with others, but being thanks to others. The experience of the self, also, it refers to the non-transferable and transcendent self that I am, cannot be explained except with the others with whom I coexist and for whom I am responsible. For this reason, Karol Wojtyła used to say, and quote, another human being is a neighbor not only on the basis of his generic feeling of humanity, but primarily on the basis of his being another self, end of the quote. With this in mind, we can say a person is a true ontological subject of rational, relational nature. Why we should remember this? Mainly to discover that the experience of my own irreplaceable being is constituted in an original way together with the equally irreplaceable experience of my neighbor. This is more foundational than the experience of participating in a common humanity. In other words, our common belonging to the species is not the deepest reason for the peculiar bond that each person has with each of his brothers and sisters. The basic reason why, in order to affirm myself, I need to accept the practical challenge of the presence of the other is that the other is as much a person as I am. Indeed, the other doesn't only occur as part of my most elementary experience in the theoretical order, but it occurs mainly as an experience in the practical order. That is, as a concrete imperative that demands an adequate value response. If I am a unique, unrepeatable, and irreplaceable case, and my neighbor is also unique, then a primary moral norm emerges that I cannot leave aside. Persona est affirmanda propter se ipsam. We must love the person for its own sake. The value of my neighbor is not that of an interchangeable or substitutable being. His value is the highest because he's a being of whom there can be no copy whatsoever. This discovery makes it possible to make the most important universalization in practical life. Every human person has the very high value of a true end and not a mere means. The proposition is maximally normative. This proposition is maximally normative and true, especially in cases where a purely efficient-based approach blurs the perception of the inalienable dignity of the human person. In other words, the encounter with the other is a primarily ethical experience that constantly invites us to rediscover the non-instantializable character of people, especially of those whose functional diversity segregates them and displaces them from the gaze culture, public policies, etc. Number 3, the sources of roots of the dignity of disabled persons. The sources of the dignity of the disabled person cannot be different from those of the functional person, for dignity doesn't come from the fulfillment of some functional standard, but from the way being has been given to us, making us incomparably unique, making us truly ends. Dignity is the value possessed by a being whose being is given in a loving act of benevolence. Therefore, to discover one's own dignity, to a large extent, is to discover that we are what we are because we are loved in a special way, in a very particular way, for our own sake. Or as the Spanish semi-anarchist philosopher Carlos Diaz used to say, amor ergo sum. I am loved, therefore I am. This is the origin or root of the ontological dignity of the human person as person. And this dignity gives rise to fundamental rights such as the right to life, to physical integrity, to the right to freedom of conscience of the person, etc. When ontological dignity is made to rest on the conscious state of the person, on a certain standard of neurological efficiency, on the activation of mental processes, or on something else similar, we immediately enter a scenario marked by absurdity. The fundamental dignity of the person would be subject to different degrees and levels, placing those who do not reach a certain threshold in a state of a mere thing. People would not possess dignity because of their being, but because of their conscious doing. And with that, there would be inequality of fundamental rights. This is relevant in the case of persons with mental disabilities. The fact that there are certain deficits in mental processes, either temporarily or permanently, doesn't mean that the person ceases to be a person and or loses his or her dignity. The profound reason for this is the following. The being of the person doesn't presuppose consciousness, but rather it is consciousness that presupposes being. If there is no being prior to consciousness, there is no place to return to through consciousness processes. Consciousness is always consciousness of being. All the consciential maturation that genetic psychology usually studies is possibly thanks to the fact that the being of the I is always greater and more original than what we consciously consider of it. Being and conscious being are not correlative. The first founds the second, not vice versa. Now, having said this, the ontological dignity of the person can manifest itself through conscious acts. This is the root of the right to freedom of expression, education, political participation, etc. Likewise, the ontological dignity of the person can be exhibited through free acts when they are performed in accordance with the demands of their highest value. This is where the moral dignity of the person is displayed. This dignity obviously admits degrees and levels depending on the moral quality of the actions. On this level is based, for example, the right to person's good reputation and the right to reply to an unjust accusation. Finally, there is a dignity granted by the community to persons who enjoy certain special qualities, such as their intelligence, their goodness, their role of authority, or their singular social significance. For example, here rests the dignity of magistrates or judges, but in general also of all persons who are socially recognized positively for some quality. This dignity is also important for people with disabilities, because in some cases, their great kindness and simplicity, their artistic abilities or technical skills, endow them with a freely granted dignity. This source of dignity for people with disabilities is no less important. In a certain sense, living with a disability should be cause for a special consideration, special respect, and care on the part of society. We are not talking here about moral dignity because of virtuous life. Rather, we are talking about the dignity that is socially attributed because of a special way of living the human condition under certain limitations that are largely caused by us, by society itself, and the context built among all of us. I think the time is finished.
Yes.
I have one page more, so I can ask Sabrina if we open the discussion in this moment or if I should go on reading.
Perhaps we open the discussion, and if we loop back to the last page, then that would be all right.
Yes, thank you, Sabrina.